In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on two-dimensional arrays. If you remember from one-dimensional arrays, when we were dealing with initializer lists, both the declaration statement and the initializer list had to be on the same line. There was no way around it. We couldn't separate. We couldn't have the declaration done on one line and then do the initialization on the second line. We had to put everything onto one line. So here's an interesting question. Could we get away with it for two-dimensional arrays? Could we have the declaration statement on one line and the initialization done on a separate line? Well, I have some good news for you. The answer to that question is yes. Yes, we can. We can do that. There's a caveat though. When we declare the array, we do have to specify the sizes. So we can declare on one line and then initialize the array on another line. We just have to make sure that when we're declaring, we include the last indices of the array, which indirectly means we're specifying the sizes. So let me give you an example of how we would do this. So we can have the following code where we would have a two-dimensional array of integers called num_array, and we see that we pass 2 and 2. Well, I shouldn't say pass, we put them in the parentheses, which means that this is going to be a two-dimensional array with 3 rows and 3 columns. And then on this second line, we see that we can do num_array equals, and then we have our initialization. So we should mention that we would have to put the name of the array on the second line. So what we're basically doing is taking the initializer list and then assigning it to our two-dimensional array. But this is allowed for two-dimensional arrays. Just as with one-dimensional arrays, each element in a two-dimensional array would be treated as an individual variable. We just have to make sure that when we access a particular variable that we specify both the row index and the column index. We have to specify both. We've already seen a couple of examples of this in the last lecture, but let's just go over a couple more examples of how we would actually use this in our code just to get a better idea. So let's say we have the following lines of code. The first line, we're declaring a two-dimensional array of strings called names, and because we have a 5 and a 1, it means we're going to have 6 rows and 2 columns. And what that tells us is that the index of the rows can be anywhere between 0 and 5, and then the index for the columns can be anywhere between 0 and 1, which means it's just 0 or 1. So what we can do is if we want to store a string in an array element, we'd have the name of the array, parentheses, and then the indices. So the second line means that we're going to store Mike at index 0 and 0. So this would be the first column and the first row. The second line, we're going to take the string Johnson and we're going to store that in a specific element. And we're given the indices 2 and 1. So that means we're going to store this in the third row and the second column. And then the last one, we're going to store the string Clark in the, let's see, we have the indices 5 and 1, which tells us that we're going to put this in the 6th row and the second column. Here is another example of where we can access individual elements of a two-dimensional array. And in this case, we're actually going to use what we call a nested for loop. If you're familiar with other programming languages, you should be familiar with a nested for loop, but the idea is we're going to put a for loop inside of another for loop. So here we have a two-dimensional array of integers that's called num_array, and we have 5 and 5, which means that we have 6 rows and 6 columns. So what we can do is we create an outer for loop where we're going to use the variable row, so that's right here, we declare that as an integer, that's going to go from 0 to 5. So just as we've used for loops to handle one-dimensional arrays, because the value that we use to increment would be a great candidate for the index of a one-dimensional array, we can do the same thing for two-dimensional arrays. It's just now we're using nested loops. So this row variable is going to correspond to the row index of our two-dimensional array. And then inside that for loop, we have another for loop where we have a variable called call, and that's also going to go from 0 to 5, and this is going to correspond to the column index of our two-dimensional array. So now what we can do is instead of just putting in exact values for the row and column index, we can just use these variables that would have the row and column indices. So what we see that's going on inside the inner for loop is we're going to set num_array of row and col to 100. Essentially what we're doing here is just saying that every single element of this array is going to be 100, but let's actually walk through this just a little bit. So the first time we go through this array, row is 0 and column is 0, so we're going to set num_array 0, 0 to 100, and then we're going to increment the column number. So that means we're going to then set num_array 0, 1 to 100, and then we'll do 0, 2, and then 0, 3, and then 0, 4, and then 0, 5. So all those will be set to 100. The next iteration, well, we're done with the inner for loop, so that means we're now going to do the next iteration of the outer for loop, which means row is going to become 1. And then we repeat all the steps for the inner for loop. So now we're going to set num_array 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, all to 100. So then we would increment our row element again, or row variable, and set that to 2. So then we would set num_array 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5, all to 100. So we would just keep repeating this until both row and col would be 5. That would be the last element of the array, and then by then all the elements in our two-dimensional array would be 100. Here is another example that's very similar to our previous example. We still have a two-dimensional array of integers, and we still have a nested for loop, we still have our row, we still have our call, and they're going to go from 0 to 5, so we're going to have several iterations of all these loops. The only difference now is instead of just setting all the elements to be 100, we're going to have the user enter in a value. This is actually a preferred way of initializing an array, where we can have the user enter all the values that the user wants for each element of the array. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to create a string first, and this is going to be our prompt. So notice in the next line, we're going to take the string, enter the number at row, and then we're going to concatenate the row number, and then we're going to concatenate the word column, and then concatenate the column number. So for example, if this were the first iteration, this string would say, enter the number at row 0 and column 0. And then what we see in the next line is we're going to use our input box method. So we're going to pass the string. So an input box is going to be displayed where we would ask the user to enter the number that's going to be at row 0 and column 0. That's going to be stored as a string. So then we convert that to a number, or an integer in this case, using our val method. And then we're going to store that in our array element with the row and col index values. So what we're doing here is each element of the array, we are going to ask the user to enter a number at that specified row and column.